Murder in the Sensory Deprivation, narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome and thank you for being here tonight. Before we begin, I have a little question for you. Can you remember when you first discovered the darker side of wellness culture? Was it a troubling news story, a friend's experience, or perhaps your own brushes with pseudoscience? Share your thoughts in the comments. I always love hearing how people awaken to the hidden dangers lurking beneath self-care's shiny veneer. Now get comfortable with your beverage of choice and let's begin. Chapter 1. The Tank's Silent Witness. The Serenity Springs Wellness Spa occupied a converted Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Whitmore Village, its elegant facade promising peace and restoration to those seeking respite from the chaos of modern life. Miss Jane Marple had arrived on this October afternoon with considerable scepticism regarding the establishment's claims, though her concern for her great-niece's well-being had ultimately persuaded her to accompany the young woman to what was billed as a revolutionary float therapy session. The treatment room itself was tucked away in the spa's lower level, a space designed to minimize sensory input through careful attention to lighting, temperature, and acoustics. The large stainless steel tank dominated the room, its surface perfectly still beneath soft amber lighting that cast everything in shades of warm honey. Miss Marple had positioned herself in the comfortable observation area, from which she could observe the proceedings through a discreet window whilst maintaining a respectful distance. The spa's manager, a woman named Catherine Vale, who possessed the peculiar brightness of someone professionally committed to enthusiasm, had explained that the tank contained precisely calibrated salt water, 9 times more buoyant than the Dead Sea itself, allowing clients to float effortlessly while their minds experienced profound relaxation. The client scheduled for this particular session was Dr. James Whitmore, a respected hypnotherapist whose practice occupied elegant offices in the village's most prestigious address. Catherine had mentioned his name with the sort of reverence typically reserved for minor celebrities, noting that he was one of their most valued patrons, having used float therapy as a complement to his therapeutic work for the past 3 years. At precisely 2 o'clock, Dr. Whitmore arrived. A man of perhaps 55 years, with the studied composure and calculating gaze that Miss Marple had learned to associate with individuals who possessed considerable power over vulnerable minds. His manner was impeccable, his appearance immaculate, yet something in the way his eyes moved across the room suggested a consciousness perpetually evaluating those around him for advantage. Catherine prepared him for the session with the meticulous care she habitually applied to all her clients, explaining that he had booked the full 90-minute experience and that she would monitor his vital signs through the tank's integrated systems. The water temperature would remain constant at 94 degrees, precisely matching skin temperature, which would enhance the sensation of weightlessness and promote the neurological conditions necessary for deep therapeutic states. Miss Marple observed as Dr. Whitmore disrobed behind a privacy screen and entered the tank with practiced ease, settling into the warm salt solution until he was fully reclined, supported entirely by the water's extraordinary buoyancy. Catherine sealed the tank's cover, activated the gentle ambient music that would permeate the enclosed space, and dimmed the lights to near darkness. She then withdrew to her monitoring station, a desk positioned outside the tank room where various instruments recorded the client's heart rate, respiration, and other physiological markers. The session, she explained to Miss Marple, would proceed uninterrupted for the full duration unless Dr. Whitmore pressed the panic button positioned within the tank, which would immediately alert her to any discomfort. What followed was a period of unusual stillness, broken only by the soft electronic humming of the monitoring equipment and the occasional sound of the building's ventilation system. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious nature of modern wellness practices, so often adopted by those seeking to escape rather than confront the genuine sources of their distress. She'd settled herself with her knitting, a project she always carried for such occasions, when Catherine suddenly rose from her monitoring station with evident concern. Something appeared to be registering abnormally on the vital signs display. The spa manager's composed expression faltered momentarily as she checked the readings again. Still, her professional certainty giving way to visible alarm. An hour into the session, Catherine approached the tank to confirm that everything remained satisfactory, as was her standard procedure. What she discovered when she opened the tank's cover transformed concern into absolute horror. Dr. Whitmore lay motionless in the water, his body limp and his face bearing the greyish pallor that unmistakably indicates the absence of life. Catherine's scream brought immediate assistance from other staff members, but the medical reality was apparent to anyone with even modest first aid knowledge. The man had drowned in the very solution that was supposed to make drowning physically impossible. By the time the police arrived, the tank's water had been tested preliminarily by the spa's nurse, a woman named Margaret who had been trained in basic water chemistry. Her findings were profoundly disturbing. The water showed none of the characteristic saltiness that should have defined its composition. Instead, preliminary testing suggested the presence of fresh water, or nearly fresh water, which would have eliminated the buoyancy that Dr. Whitmore had relied upon for the entire duration of his session. The shift in water composition appeared to have occurred sometime during his time in the tank, though the exact mechanism of such a change remained unclear. Inspector Harold Thornton arrived with the methodical purposefulness that had earned him considerable respect across several villages in the region. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, with the sort of patient observational skills that Miss Marple recognised as the hallmark of a competent investigator. His initial examination of the scene revealed what appeared to be an extraordinarily deliberate act of sabotage. The tank's filtration system showed signs of recent tampering, and the freshwater dispenser that the spa used for rinsing equipment had been relocated from its usual position to immediately adjacent to the tank's refill port. Someone with knowledge of the spa's systems and access to the facility had deliberately substituted the salt solution with fresh water, a change that would render the tank's fundamental property of buoyancy entirely inoperative. Chapter 2. The Confidential Files Discovered. Inspector Thornton conducted his preliminary investigation with the methodical precision that characterized his approach to complex cases. The discovery of the water substitution marked this death as no simple tragedy, but as an act requiring planning, knowledge, and deliberate malice. The spa staff remained on premises under police supervision, whilst the inspector began the process of establishing who had accessed the tank room during the hours preceding Dr. Whitmore's session. The security system revealed that the facility's back entrance had been accessed approximately 2 hours before the scheduled appointment, though the access card used belonged to someone no longer employed by the spa. Miss Marple, who had remained at the facility at the inspector's request, observed the proceedings from her position near the tea service that Catherine had prepared in the spa's main reception area. She had noticed something during her examination of the tank room that seemed to escape the initial attention of the police investigation. The monitoring station possessed 2 separate display screens, one positioned to face the tank room entrance and another angled toward the equipment itself. The second screen, the one that would have displayed vital signs to anyone standing at the monitoring desk, showed evidence of having been recently disconnected and then hastily reconnected, evident from the slightly askew positioning of its cables and the faint dust marks that suggested recent disturbance. Her observations were interrupted by the arrival of a woman whom Catherine introduced as Victoria Hayes, a psychologist specialising in trauma recovery, who maintained offices in the adjacent building. Victoria appeared visibly shaken by the news of Dr. Whitmore's death, her composed professional manner barely concealing considerable distress. She explained to the inspector that she'd been scheduled to meet with Dr. Whitmore at 3 o'clock that afternoon to discuss a mutual patient, a matter of some professional concern regarding the therapeutic approaches he had been employing with vulnerable individuals seeking recovery from trauma. Miss Marple found herself studying Victoria's face with particular attention, noting the way her hands moved with barely concealed agitation and the slight tremor in her voice when she spoke of Dr. Whitmore. There was something in her expression that suggested far more than simple professional concern. No, something that might more accurately be characterized as profound moral disapproval barely contained by professional courtesy. When Victoria departed following her preliminary statement, Miss Marple requested a private word with Inspector Thornton. The inspector received her observations with the respectful attention that he had learned to accord to her insights over previous occasions when their investigations had coincided. Miss Marple directed his attention to the monitoring station's irregularities, suggesting that the deliberate separation of the vital signs display from the observation position was significant. If the display had been deliberately hidden from Catherine's view, then someone must have anticipated her assumption that normal monitoring would proceed throughout the session. The manipulation of the monitoring system suggested foreknowledge of the session's schedule and the intention to ensure that Dr. Whitmore's physical distress would not be immediately apparent to the spa's staff. Inspector Thornton absorbed this analysis with evident appreciation, his respect for Miss Marple's investigative capabilities appearing to increase with each observation she offered. He arranged for the monitoring equipment to be photographed and sealed as evidence, noting that the deliberate sabotage of safety systems elevated the crime beyond simple poisoning into the realm of carefully premeditated murder. The combination of water substitution and monitoring manipulation suggested an individual with genuine knowledge of the spa's operations and the technical proficiency to execute such deception. The inspector's next move was to examine Dr. Whitmore's personal effects, which had been placed in a secure locker following his death. Inside, along with his clothing and wallet, they discovered a leather briefcase containing approximately 24 case files, bearing the confidential notations of therapeutic practice. Inspector Thornton began his examination of these files with appropriate caution, aware that the contents would likely contain sensitive information regarding individuals in psychological vulnerability. However, one particular pattern began to emerge as he reviewed the files with Miss Marple's assistance. The case notes revealed that Dr. Whitmore had employed hypnotherapy sessions with remarkable frequency, as often recommending multiple sessions per week to clients dealing with seemingly minor anxiety or stress-related issues. More disturbingly, his notes frequently referenced the recovery of repressed memories, particularly memories involving childhood trauma and family dysfunction. Miss Marple observed that in case after case, clients who had entered therapy with relatively moderate emotional difficulties had emerged from Dr. Whitmore's care with elaborate narratives of severe abuse, frequently resulting in complete estrangement from family members and, in several cases, accusations that had resulted in criminal investigations. One file in particular captured Miss Marple's attention. The name on the cover was simply marked AC, but the contents described in meticulous detail a purported recovery of false memories involving incestuous abuse by the client's father. The notes indicated that Dr. Whitmore had engaged in repeated sessions designed to reinforce these narratives, employing suggestive questioning and leading statements that had gradually constructed an increasingly elaborate and traumatic history. The father had ultimately taken his own life following the accusation, leaving behind a note expressing complete bewilderment at the allegations and declaring his innocence despite the mounting social condemnation he faced. Chapter 3. The Patterns of Professional Betrayal. Inspector Thornton recognized the gravity of what the case files revealed, understanding that Dr. Whitmore's death might well be connected to the profound harm that his unethical therapeutic practices had inflicted on vulnerable individuals and their families. He arranged for comprehensive interviews with each of the individuals whose files had been discovered in the briefcase, a process that would require considerable time and sensitivity given the psychological damage already inflicted by Dr. Whitmore's manipulative practices. Miss Marple requested permission to conduct preliminary interviews with several of the individuals listed in the files, an unusual request that the inspector might have denied had he not developed considerable confidence in her ability to establish rapport with witnesses. She began with a woman named Eleanor March, whose file documented the purported recovery of elaborate memories of childhood sexual abuse. Eleanor appeared at their interview visibly relieved to have an opportunity to discuss what she described as her recovery journey, though as Miss Marple gently probed the details of her memories, certain inconsistencies began to emerge. Eleanor's description of specific traumatic incidents lacked the concrete sensory details that genuine memories typically contain. Instead, her narratives possessed the quality of stories constructed through repeated retelling, with details that seemed to have been refined and elaborated through multiple recitations. When Miss Marple asked Eleanor specific questions about the chronology of events, the woman's certainty wavered considerably, and she admitted that the memories had not emerged naturally, but rather through Dr. Whitmore's explicit suggestion and repeated reinforcement over the course of nearly 30 hypnotherapy sessions. Miss Marple's most significant discovery came from an interview with a woman named Helen Sutton, whose file had been marked with particular notes regarding the successful implantation of false memories involving her mother's alleged psychological abuse. Helen had entered therapy with what Dr. Whitmore's initial notes characterized as mild anxiety related to work stress. Yet, through the course of therapeutic sessions, Helen had gradually constructed an elaborate narrative implicating her mother in years of emotional cruelty and neglect. The woman had subsequently attempted suicide, an outcome that Miss Marple found profoundly troubling. As Helen spoke about her therapeutic experience, tears streaming down her face as she described the moment when she had finally recognized the falsity of the memories that Dr. Whitmore had implanted in her consciousness, Miss Marple felt the familiar weight of witnessing human suffering born from professional betrayal. Helen admitted that following her mother's suicide attempt, she had begun to question the narratives that Dr. Whitmore had so carefully constructed, eventually recognizing them as fabrications designed to increase his therapeutic influence and control over her psychological state. It was Helen who provided Miss Marple with the most crucial piece of information. She mentioned that she had recently encountered another former patient of Dr. Whitmore's at a support group for individuals recovering from unethical therapeutic practices. This woman, whose name was Anne Catherine Richards, and who corresponded to the AC designation in the briefcase files, had been particularly devastated by the consequences of Dr. Whitmore's manipulative implantation of false memories. Anne Catherine's father, a man named Robert Richards, had taken his own life 18 months previously following the accusation of incest that Dr. Whitmore had helped construct in his daughter's consciousness. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Anne Catherine had lost her father to suicide based on memories that Dr. Whitmore had essentially manufactured through systematic psychological manipulation. The grief and rage that such an experience would generate seemed impossible to adequately express in words. Yet Miss Marple recognized that such emotions might easily provide motivation for the kind of calculated revenge that Dr. Whitmore's death represented. Chapter 4. The Chemistry of Coincidence. Inspector Thornton located Anne Catherine Richards at her place of employment, a technical supply company where she worked in the materials division. She was a woman of perhaps 30 years, with the kind of careful composure that Miss Marple recognized as the protective mechanism adopted by those who had experienced profound emotional trauma. When informed of Dr. Whitmore's death, Anne Catherine's reaction was carefully controlled, though Miss Marple observed the slight pallor that crossed her face and the way her hands trembled momentarily before she regained her customary composure. Under questioning, Anne Catherine admitted to significant anger toward Dr. Whitmore, anger that she characterized as justified given the devastating consequences his therapeutic practices had inflicted on her family. However, she steadfastly maintained that she had not been present at the spa on the day of his death, claiming instead that she had spent the afternoon at her place of employment, a claim that her supervisor confirmed. Yet Miss Marple noted that the timing of Anne Catherine's employment verification was somewhat convenient, and she wondered whether the supervisor might have been influenced by loyalty or friendship to provide support for an alibi that might not withstand closer examination. The investigation acquired new urgency when Inspector Thornton received the toxicology results on the fresh water that had replaced the salt solution in the float tank. The analysis revealed the presence of a compound typically used in laboratory and industrial applications, a chemical that was not commonly available to the general public, but could be obtained by individuals working in technical supply industries. More specifically, the concentration and purity of the compound suggested that it had come from a professional source rather than being extracted from commercial applications. This discovery directed the investigation toward Anne Catherine with increasing intensity, as her employment in material supply at a technical company provided both access to and familiarity with the specific chemical compound that had been substituted in the tank. The inspector obtained a warrant to examine her personal residence, hoping to discover evidence linking her to the acquisition of the chemical or to the spa's security system. However, Anne Catherine's home revealed nothing of immediate significance, suggesting either that she'd taken considerable precautions to avoid leaving evidence or that the circumstantial connections being constructed by the investigation might ultimately prove insufficient to establish her guilt. Miss Marple, however, had begun to develop considerable doubt regarding Anne Catherine's involvement in Dr. Whitmore's death. The woman's suffering was genuine, so her rage at the therapist entirely justified, yet something about the crime itself seemed inconsistent with Anne Catherine's character. The meticulous planning required to execute the sabotage, the technical proficiency necessary to manipulate the monitoring systems, and the premeditated nature of the offence all suggested an individual with a particular type of mind and particular advantages that Anne Catherine, for all her legitimate reasons to desire Dr. Whitmore's death, did not appear to possess. It was Catherine Vale, the spa manager, who provided Miss Marple with the crucial insight that redirected the investigation. During a casual conversation conducted whilst Catherine prepared fresh tea, the spa manager mentioned that the tank's monitoring system had been substantially upgraded approximately 6 months previously. The installation had been conducted by a technical firm that specialised in wellness facility systems, and the engineer responsible for the installation had visited the spa on multiple occasions for maintenance and calibration purposes. Catherine provided the name of the firm, along with the engineer's name, information that Miss Marple immediately shared with Inspector Thornton. The engineer's name was Marcus Chen, a man in his mid-40s who had developed considerable expertise in the integration of monitoring systems for spa and wellness facilities across the region. Inspector Thornton's investigation of Marcus's background revealed that he possessed the technical knowledge necessary to manipulate the monitoring equipment, regular access to the spa facility through his maintenance responsibilities, and the professional familiarity with chemical systems that would be necessary to execute the water substitution with precision. What remained unclear was Marcus's motivation for engaging in such an elaborate act of sabotage and murder. Chapter 5. The hidden trauma emerges. The breakthrough came when Inspector Thornton arranged to interview Marcus Chen at his residence, accompanied by Miss Marple, who had requested to observe the interview based on her observations during the investigation thus far. The engineer's home was precisely organised, containing extensive technical manuals, equipment specifications, and detailed notes on various maintenance projects. However, one item in particular captured Miss Marple's attention. Amid the technical documents, she discovered a collection of personal letters and photographs, carefully preserved in a locked drawer that Marcus had initially attempted to avoid opening. The letters were addressed to Marcus from his sister, Sarah, and they documented a deeply troubling journey through therapy with Dr. Whitmore. Sarah had entered treatment for moderate anxiety related to a career transition, yet through the course of hypnotherapy sessions, she had gradually constructed elaborate narratives implicating Marcus himself in childhood abuse. The letters demonstrated the progressive deterioration of Marcus's relationship with his sister as Dr. Whitmore's manipulations grew more intense, with Sarah eventually severing all contact with him based on memories that had been essentially manufactured through the therapist's suggestive techniques. Marcus's final letter from his sister was dated approximately 3 months prior to Dr. Whitmore's death. In it, Sarah expressed her certainty that Marcus had deliberately perpetrated severe emotional and physical abuse during their childhood, despite the historical record and the absence of any corroborating evidence from other family members. The letter concluded with Sarah stating that she was severing all contact permanently and that she did not wish to hear from Marcus again under any circumstances. The pain evident in Marcus's response, written but never sent, was almost unbearable to witness. As Inspector Thornton questioned Marcus regarding Dr. Whitmore's death, the engineer initially maintained his denial of involvement. However, when the inspector presented the evidence of his access to the spa's systems, his technical proficiency with the monitoring equipment, and his possession of the expertise necessary to execute the sabotage, Marcus's composure gradually disintegrated. He admitted finally to spending the preceding months carefully planning Dr. Whitmore's death, researching the float tank's specifications, developing the means to substitute the salt solution, and ensuring that the monitoring system would not alert SPA staff to the crisis unfolding within the tank. Miss Marple observed, as Marcus described the terrible logic that had driven his actions. His sister, who had been the closest family member in his life, had been turned against him through Dr. Whitmore's deliberate implantation of false memories and traumatic narratives. The professional psychologist had essentially stolen Sarah's consciousness, transforming her into a person unrecognizable to her family, motivated by fabricated memories of events that had never occurred. When Marcus's attempts to communicate with Sarah, to demonstrate the falsity of her memories through rational discussion and family testimony, had failed, he had begun to contemplate more direct responses to what he perceived as a profound injustice. The research into float tank mechanics had revealed a crucial vulnerability. By substituting fresh water for the salt solution, an individual would gradually sink, the loss of buoyancy preventing the easy floating position that the client would assume at the session's beginning. The progressive drowning would be slow enough that external observation might not immediately recognize the crisis, especially if the monitoring system had been manipulated to prevent accurate transmission of vital signs data. Marcus had spent weeks learning every detail of the SPA's operations, every vulnerability in its systems, every moment when access could be gained without detection. The engineering firm that employed Marcus had provided detailed facility access credentials, legitimizing his presence at the SPA on multiple occasions. He had installed the minor modification to the monitoring system that would ultimately make his sabotage possible, a technical adjustment so subtle that Catherine Vale had never questioned it. He had chosen Dr. Whitmore's regular Tuesday afternoon session, a routine that he had learned through casual conversation with Catherine, who had unknowingly provided all the information necessary for him to execute his revenge. Chapter 6. The Surveillance Truth Revealed. Inspector Thornton's interrogation of Marcus Chen produced a comprehensive confession, but not before Miss Marple had drawn attention to one remaining inconsistency in the narrative that the engineer had provided. The SPA's security system, according to its records, showed only one access event during the 2-hour period preceding Dr. Whitmore's death. Yet the water substitution would have required at least 2 separate occasions for implementation and calibration. Either the security system had malfunctioned, which seemed unlikely given the facility's recent upgrades, or the person responsible for the sabotage had found a means to access the facility that circumvented the electronic security recording. Marcus initially resisted discussing this point, but Miss Marple's persistent, gentle questioning eventually persuaded him to acknowledge the full extent of his planning. He admitted that he had worked with another individual, someone with legitimate SPA employment who could provide internal access, without triggering security alerts. This individual, whose name he had initially been reluctant to provide, was revealed to be Catherine Vale herself, the SPA manager who had treated Miss Marple with such courtesy and professionalism throughout the investigation. The implications of Catherine's involvement transformed the case entirely. Inspector Thornton immediately arranged for Catherine's detention, and her interrogation revealed a profoundly complicated personal motivation for her participation in Dr. Whitmore's murder. Catherine's own sister had been a patient of Dr. Whitmore's, and through his manipulative therapeutic techniques, the young woman had constructed false memories implicating Catherine in emotional abuse and neglect. The sister had subsequently attempted suicide, an event that had devastated Catherine and had driven her to seek employment at the spa, specifically to gain access to Dr. Whitmore during his regular sessions. Catherine's involvement had been peripheral but crucial. She had provided Marcus with the internal access necessary to implement his sabotage, had helped him manipulate the monitoring systems, and had been present during the afternoon in question, ready to ensure that his plans proceeded without interruption. Her professional position as a spa manager had provided the legitimacy necessary to prevent questioning of unusual activity in the tank room, and her regular interaction with Dr. Whitmore had allowed her to gather the detailed information regarding his schedule and preferences that had been essential for executing the sabotage. The investigation into Catherine's background revealed that she'd spent the preceding year gathering information on Dr. Whitmore's therapeutic practices, connecting with former patients and family members who had experienced the devastating consequences of his manipulative treatments. She had not initially planned to participate actively in his murder, but had become involved gradually, drawn in by her recognition of the profound harm that the psychologist had inflicted on multiple families. When Marcus had approached her with his detailed plan, she had recognized an opportunity to prevent Dr. Whitmore from continuing to destroy lives through his unethical practices. Chapter 7. The Professional Betrayal Examined. As the case progressed toward its conclusion, Inspector Thornton arranged for comprehensive examination of Dr. Whitmore's therapeutic practices and their documented consequences. The case files recovered from his briefcase provided stark evidence of deliberate psychological manipulation, systematic implantation of false memories, and calculated exploitation of vulnerable individuals seeking therapeutic assistance. Multiple families had been destroyed, relationships severed, and lives fundamentally altered based on memories that Dr. Whitmore had essentially constructed through his use of suggestive hypnotherapy techniques. The Professional Regulatory Board responsible for psychological licensing initiated an extensive investigation into Dr. Whitmore's conduct, discovering that he'd violated numerous ethical standards and that his therapeutic practices deviated substantially from accepted protocols. The board found evidence that he had deliberately pursued aggressive memory recovery techniques that contemporary psychological research had thoroughly discredited, and that he had continued employing these methods despite their known capacity to implant false memories in vulnerable clients. Miss Marple observed the unfolding investigation with her characteristic mixture of sadness and intellectual engagement. The death of Dr. Whitmore, while clearly constituting murder, had revealed a parallel crime of devastating scope. The psychologist had spent years systematically destroying lives through the deliberate implantation of traumatic false memories, yet his professional misconduct had proceeded with remarkably little resistance or intervention from the regulatory and professional structures theoretically designed to protect vulnerable clients from exactly such exploitation. The regulatory board's findings indicated that Dr. Whitmore had been reported to them multiple times over the preceding years, yet the investigation and disciplinary processes had moved with glacial slowness. Formal complaints regarding his therapeutic practices had accumulated without generating substantial consequences, allowing him to continue his destructive work while his victims multiplied. By the time his death occurred, he had fundamentally altered the lives of dozens of individuals, destroyed multiple families, and contributed to at least 3 confirmed suicides among individuals whose false memories he had implanted. Inspector Thornton acknowledged to Miss Marple that the emotional complexity of the case extended far beyond the legal parameters of murder. while Marcus Chen and Catherine Vale had clearly executed a premeditated and deliberate act of homicide. The psychological and moral dimensions of their crime remained profoundly complicated. Both individuals had acted from genuine rage at perceived injustice. Both had suffered devastating personal losses directly traceable to Dr. Whitmore's professional misconduct, and both had come to view his death as a form of justice that institutional and legal systems had failed to provide. Chapter 8. The Dual Accountability. The trial of Marcus Chen and Catherine Vale proceeded with considerable media attention as the case raised uncomfortable questions about professional accountability, the regulation of psychological practice, and the consequences when institutional systems fail to protect vulnerable individuals from exploitation. Both defendants were convicted of murder, a verdict that seemed legally inescapable given the overwhelming evidence of their deliberate planning and execution of Dr. Whitmore's death. However, the sentencing phase of the trial introduced considerable complexity. The judge acknowledged the profound harm that Dr. Whitmore had inflicted through his unethical therapeutic practices, noting that while his death could not be condoned as a response to professional misconduct, the circumstances that had motivated his murder deserved consideration. Both Marcus and Catherine received substantial prison sentences, yet the judge's statement acknowledged the partial legitimacy of their grievance against a system that had inadequately protected vulnerable individuals from professional predation. The Professional Regulatory Board subsequently initiated comprehensive reforms to their investigative and disciplinary processes, reforms that might have prevented Dr. Whitmore's years of misconduct had they been implemented earlier. The psychological profession engaged in substantial self-examination regarding the use of repressed memory recovery techniques, ultimately producing updated ethical guidelines explicitly discouraging the use of hypnotherapy for memory recovery due to its demonstrated capacity to implant false memories in vulnerable clients. Miss Marple reflected on the case with her characteristic nuance, recognizing that it presented no simple moral resolution. Dr. Whitmore's conduct had been unquestionably unethical and had caused demonstrable harm to numerous vulnerable individuals. Marcus Chen and Catherine Vale had unquestionably committed murder, a deliberate act regardless of the justification they perceived for it. Yet the case also revealed the profound inadequacy of institutional systems designed to protect vulnerable populations from professional exploitation and abuse. Chapter 9. The Unanswered Questions. Inspector Thornton consulted with Miss Marple one final time as the case neared its conclusion, seeking her perspective on the investigation and its resolution. They sat in the quiet comfort of Miss Marple's cottage, tea growing cool between them as they contemplated the tragedy that had unfolded across multiple dimensions and extended far beyond the simple fact of Dr. Whitmore's death. Outside the window, autumn rain fell steadily against the cottage panes, and the bare branches of the garden's trees seemed to mirror the skeletal exposure of truth that the investigation had gradually revealed. Miss Marple observed that while the legal case had reached its conclusion, important questions remained unanswered regarding how professional systems had failed so comprehensively to prevent Dr. Whitmore's misconduct. She noted that multiple individuals and institutions had possessed opportunities to intervene earlier, had received clear warning signs regarding his therapeutic practices, and had failed to act with appropriate urgency or decisiveness. The regulatory board, professional colleagues, concerned family members, and even previous clients who had recognized the falsity of their implanted memories had all had opportunities to prevent or minimize the harm that Dr. Whitmore continued to inflict. The inspector nodded slowly, his expression carrying the weight of recognition that law enforcement could address only the most obvious and legally actionable aspects of complex moral failures. Inspector Thornton acknowledged that while Marcus and Catherine would serve prison sentences for his murder, the broader systemic failures that had enabled his misconduct would require far more comprehensive examination and reform than any single judicial proceeding could address. Dr. Whitmore's death, tragic as it was, had at least created the circumstances necessary for his victims to be heard, for the regulatory system to be forced into action, and for the profession to undertake necessary self-examination of its own ethical blind spots and institutional inadequacies. But there remained, Miss Marple continued thoughtfully, the question of responsibility that extended beyond the immediate perpetrators of violence. When professional systems failed to protect vulnerable populations, when regulatory mechanisms moved with glacial slowness despite clear evidence of misconduct, and when colleagues remained silent in the face of obvious ethical violations, some measure of accountability necessarily extended beyond those whose hands had directly executed the final act. The psychology profession, while not legally culpable for Dr. Whitmore's death, bore unmistakable responsibility for creating the conditions that had allowed his misconduct to flourish unchecked for so many years. The inspector found himself profoundly disquieted by this perspective, yet he recognised its essential truth. He had spent his career within systems designed to address criminal behaviour after the fact, systems that rarely possessed the capacity or authority to prevent institutional failures that generated the desperation motivating such behaviour in the first place, the gaps between justice and law, between accountability and legal culpability, between systemic reform and individual prosecution, had never seemed so apparent to him as they did in contemplating the case's conclusion. Miss Marple also noted that Anne Catherine Richards, the woman whom the investigation had initially suspected, had ultimately been exonerated and had begun her own recovery journey. The recognition of how her father's death had been precipitated by false memories implanted by Dr. Whitmore, combined with the exposure of his broader patterns of professional misconduct, had provided her with some possibility of healing that had previously seemed impossible. The murder investigation, despite its tragic circumstances, had offered her family a measure of vindication that no amount of regulatory investigation could have provided alone. Yet the cost of that vindication, paid in the imprisonment of two individuals whose suffering had driven them to homicide, remained a difficult truth to contemplate. Chapter 10. The Difficult Resolution. The final chapter of the case unfolded not in courtrooms or police offices, but in the quiet spaces where victims of psychological trauma and betrayal began the long process of recovery. The regulatory board's investigation into Dr. Whitmore's conduct resulted in official findings that he'd systematically violated ethical standards and had deliberately employed discredited therapeutic techniques known to implant false memories in vulnerable clients. These findings, issued posthumously, provided families and former patients with institutional acknowledgement of the harm he had inflicted and validation of experiences that professional and social systems had frequently dismissed or minimized. The sentencing hearing for Marcus Chen and Catherine Vale proceeded with considerable solemnity, the courtroom filled with individuals whose lives had been touched by Dr. Whitmore's misconduct. Some were there to advocate for harsh punishment, viewing the defendants as murderers whose premeditation made the crime particularly reprehensible. Others attended in quiet support, recognizing in Marcus and Catherine's desperation an echo of their own experiences with systemic betrayal and institutional failure. The judge's statement acknowledged this moral complexity, noting that while Dr. Whitmore's death could not be legally justified as punishment for professional misconduct, the circumstances motivating his murder deserved consideration in sentencing decisions. Marcus Chen received a sentence of 20 years imprisonment, a substantial term that nevertheless reflected the judge's recognition that his actions, while unquestionably criminal, had been motivated by genuine rage at professional destruction of his family. Catherine Vale received 18 years, a distinction that reflected the judge's assessment that her involvement, while crucial to the crime's execution, had been secondary in terms of initial motivation and planning. Both sentences would allow for the possibility of parole after serving approximately 2/3 of their terms, a provision that suggested the judge's belief that future rehabilitation and societal reintegration might eventually be possible for both individuals. During the sentencing hearing, the judge issued a formal statement criticising the regulatory board's failure to adequately investigate and address the numerous complaints against Dr. Whitmore that had been filed over the preceding years. The judge noted that had the board acted with appropriate urgency on earlier complaints, the circumstances that had motivated Marcus and Catherine's desperation might have been prevented. While law enforcement could address only criminal behaviour, the judge suggested, the professional regulatory system bore substantial responsibility for institutional failures that had permitted Dr. Whitmore's misconduct to continue unchecked. Miss Marple received a letter from Anne Catherine Richards several months after the conclusion of the trial, a communication expressing gratitude for the investigation's role in exposing Dr. Whitmore's misconduct and providing her family with official recognition that her father's suicide had been precipitated by false memories rather than by actual failings or behaviours on his part. The letter indicated that Anne Catherine and her extended family had begun a cautious process of rebuilding relationships fractured by the false memories that Dr. Whitmore had implanted, a process that would require considerable time and emotional work, but that had at least become possible following official acknowledgement of the harm. The letter also contained information about Anne Catherine's ongoing recovery work with Victoria Hayes, the trauma psychologist who had been present during the initial investigation. Victoria's ethical therapeutic approach, based on genuine evidence and careful avoidance of suggestive techniques, had provided Anne Catherine with a framework for understanding her experiences without the danger of implanting additional false memories in pursuit of therapeutic resolution. The contrast between Victoria's careful, evidence-based approach and Dr. Whitmore's manipulative, suggestive techniques illustrated the profound difference that ethical professional practice could make in the lives of vulnerable individuals seeking therapeutic assistance. Marcus Chen and Catherine Vale had both become inadvertent catalysts for systemic change within the psychological profession. Their trial had generated substantial public attention to the risks of aggressive repressed memory recovery techniques, resulting in significant revision of professional guidelines and increased skepticism toward therapeutic approaches that lacked robust empirical support. Universities and training programs began substantially emphasizing the critical importance of avoiding suggestive therapeutic techniques, recognizing that the human memory's capacity for false recollection could be exploited even by well-intentioned practitioners operating within established professional frameworks. The American Psychological Association issued updated guidelines explicitly discouraging the use of hypnotherapy for memory recovery, recommending instead evidence-based approaches that emphasized the unreliability of memory and the dangers of suggestive questioning. Professional training programs added comprehensive modules addressing the risks of implanting false memories, drawing directly on the documented consequences of Dr. Whitmore's therapeutic practices. Ethics boards across multiple states initiated retroactive review of cases involving aggressive repressed memory recovery, leading to disciplinary action against several other psychologists whose practices had echoed Dr. Whitmore's fundamental ethical failures. As Miss Marple reflected on the case's conclusion, she recognized that it presented no simple moral resolution but rather a complex illustration of how institutional failures and professional misconduct could generate consequences extending far beyond the immediate victims. Dr. Whitmore's death, while legally constituting murder, had revealed a parallel crime of devastating scope that institutional systems had failed to prevent or adequately address. The legal system had held Marcus Chen and Catherine Vale accountable for their deliberate act of homicide, yet the broader accountability for Dr. Whitmore's years of professional misconduct had required investigation into systemic failures and professional irresponsibility that no criminal court could adequately address. The case had also demonstrated the importance of careful observation and rigorous examination of evidence. Yes, qualities that Miss Marple had employed throughout the investigation to move beyond initial suspicions and circumstantial connections toward a more complete understanding of the events that resulted in Dr. Whitmore's death. She had recognized that Anne Catherine Richards, while possessing legitimate motivation and a superficial connection to the crime's execution, had ultimately been innocent of actual involvement. She had identified the crucial inconsistencies in the security system's records that had pointed toward Catherine Vale's internal involvement. She had observed that Marcus Chen's technical expertise and his concealed personal trauma connected him directly to Dr. Whitmore's death. The Serenity Springs Wellness Spa eventually reopened under new management approximately 8 months following Dr. Whitmore's death, with comprehensive reforms to its security systems, monitoring protocols, and client protection procedures. Catherine Vale's position as manager was filled by someone with genuine professional commitment to client well-being rather than personal vengeance or hidden motivations. The facility's new director, a woman named Helena Cross, who had worked previously in therapeutic settings and who possessed both clinical training and administrative experience, instituted comprehensive screening procedures designed to identify clients who might be vulnerable to unethical therapeutic manipulation. The float tanks continued to offer the genuine therapeutic benefits that sensory deprivation can provide when administered appropriately and ethically. Contemporary neuroscience had increasingly validated the capacity of float therapy to reduce anxiety, lower blood pressure, and promote relaxation when employed as a standalone treatment or as complement to other evidence-based therapeutic approaches. Yet the spa's reopening occurred under the shadow of the recognition that wellness practices, like all professional interventions involving human vulnerability, require robust ethical frameworks and rigorous accountability. Miss Marple maintained correspondence with both Victoria Hayes and Helena Cross following the case's conclusion, providing consultation regarding the psychological and operational aspects of establishing ethical therapeutic frameworks. Her insights regarding the recognition of vulnerability, the identification of predatory patterns, and the importance of maintaining systematic checks on professional power proved invaluable in developing protocols designed to protect clients from the type of exploitation that Dr. Whitmore had practiced with such devastating consequences. As winter approached the village of Whitmore, Miss Marple found herself once more reflecting on the case, with the characteristic thoughtfulness that had served her well throughout her years of observing human nature in all its complexity. The murder of Dr. Whitmore had ultimately revealed not simple evil, but rather a complicated interplay of professional misconduct, institutional failure, personal trauma, and individual desperation. Justice had been served through the conviction of Dr. Whitmore's killers, yet the deeper injustices that had motivated their actions remained imperfectly addressed despite the regulatory board's investigations and the profession's subsequent reforms. The case had also reinforced Miss Marple's long-held conviction that careful observation of human behaviour, patient attention to inconsistencies and irregularities, and genuine compassion for those suffering from systemic betrayal were the most reliable tools for approaching complex truth. She had employed these tools throughout the investigation to move beyond initial suspicions and obvious conclusions toward a more complete and nuanced understanding of events that had destroyed multiple lives across multiple families. The resolution of the legal case represented not an ending but rather a beginning of the longer, more difficult process through which victims and their families might gradually move toward healing in the aftermath of profound betrayal. The spa's peaceful aesthetic remained largely unchanged, with soft lighting and the gentle sound of water still promising respite to visitors seeking relief from life's burdens. Yet beneath that peaceful surface lay the recognition that well-being itself, when pursued through therapeutic relationships, required the same careful ethical attention and systemic accountability that all human interactions involving vulnerability and trust necessarily demanded. Dr. Whitmore's death had served as a tragic reminder of these fundamental truths, and the investigation that had exposed the circumstances surrounding his murder had ultimately served the broader purpose of strengthening the safeguards designed to protect vulnerable individuals from professional exploitation and abuse. In the months and years following the case's conclusion, the regulatory board would point to the investigation's outcomes as evidence of the necessity for comprehensive reform, and the psychology profession would gradually implement the changes that should have been undertaken far earlier, before Dr. Whitmore's victims had become so numerous and before desperation had driven two individuals to homicidal revenge.